you guys a quick poll question here as we get rolling for the day and talk about managing horses on small acreages in North Dakota. And so a lot of what we are going to talk about today is going to be specific to North Dakota. However, I think we can apply this wherever you're at. So if it's rules and regulations we're talking about, you can go to your state extension person and ask them, what are our rules and regs here? All right, so up on your screen, you should see a poll that says, how many acres do you currently manage? So if you want to just fill that out for me quick, that gives Paige and I an idea of who's on today and what kind of acreages we're dealing with. Let's see. We're pretty well split down with all the acres I put up there. So a handful, about 22% of 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. I mean, we're split all the way. So, okay, we have some things. So now in the chat, before we get started, I want to hear what your guys' biggest challenge is on your current acreage. And so we saw the acreage was pretty well evenly split, 1 to 20 plus. But tell us what your current biggest challenge is. Mud. Oh man, no doubt. Weed management, keeping it viable all summer, and mud and weed management. Okay. Weeds, those darn weeds. Grass management during dry months. Yes, we're going to have some potential droughty conditions here. Manure management. Thanks, Cindy, for talking about manure. We're going to cover that a little bit today. Very good. So you guys are more than welcome to continue to type those in. I'm going to get rid of that on my screen and we're going to keep rolling. So when Paige and I started putting this together last week, I came at Paige and I said, man, I said, there's just no way that I can structure this without structuring it around manure. And she did not argue with me. And so a lot of this discussion today is going to be about manure and manure management because I think that becomes really important when we're dealing with all the other pieces of putting your place together or managing your place. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about dry lots, or what some of us would call sacrifice areas. So we'll get into that after a while. So we're going to start with manure. In the manure and dry lot area, we'll talk a little bit about parasites and mud. And then I'm going to turn it over at the end for Paige to touch on grazing and some water fencing, weed control, and those things. And so we'll cover all of it today. We're going to go quick. We're going to touch on everything. Keep in mind that a lot of these things we do have full hour webinars on, or maybe even multiple hour webinars on. That's all in the YouTube list that I said we put together for you. All of the videos are in there. And so instead of linking them up and making it look absolutely crazy for you on the slide, just know that that resource is in here. And you can go, if you're like, well, I really struggle with mud and they only had one slide on it, we do have an extended version of those things. Okay, so why manage manure? And if you have been here before, you have heard this, and still I want to talk about it. Manure contains valuable nutrients that plants need. So the manure that your horses are making is useful, but if we don't manage it properly, it does become a pollutant and is considered a waste then. So improper manure storage and land application leads to excess soil nutrients. It only needs what it needs. It doesn't need extra. Surface runoff, which leads to potential issues like we see over here in this picture with our harmful algal bloom, leachate, which gets into our water, our groundwater, and then water contaminated with manure. Then there's other things too. So it's not just those things, it's other things as well that manure affects. So our external parasites like flies, bacteria and pathogens, rodents. We don't want rodents. Odors, because we want our place to look nice and not stink. Internal parasites, big deal. And weed seeds, which several of you commented on. And then, like I said, just visual appearance in general. It's just nice when things look nice. Okay, so manure stacking and stockpiling guidelines in North Dakota. So some of us call it manure stacking and some of us call it manure stockpiling. Just really depends on what part of the country you're from. But there are some guidelines in North Dakota. in other states, there'll be guidelines, there'll be rules, there'll be regulations. And so just again, this would be the part where I talked earlier that if you are in a different state and you're thinking, well, this does not pertain to me, just know that probably there's something like this in your state, and you should go talk to your local extension person or your manure extension person and see if they can help you find that the guidelines or the recommendations for your state. So in North Dakota, short-term manure stockpiles, manure may not be stockpiled for more than 9 months at a time in one location, and that same location cannot be used from year to year. There are things called permanent manure stockpile areas, so there you can leave it there all the time for as long as you want to. But that involves some soil investigation and regulatory oversight just to make sure that we have the proper land that we're putting that on, the proper area and site selection, so that we're not contaminating our waters. We're not having leaching like we talked about, or runoff like we talked about in the previous slide. No matter where you're at or what you're doing, sandy soils have rapid permeability. So what that means is the nutrients are going to flow through there really quickly, leaching. Clay soils have slower permeability. They help to maintain the nitrate or the nutrients in that soil profile. Something to keep in mind is our depth to groundwater and location of surface water when we're picking a site of where we're going to put our manure. And not just our manure, but really then that leads to our sacrifice area or dry lot in general. Okay, so again, no matter where you're at, what part of the country you're in, this becomes important. Manure stockpiles may not be located in gravel pits, in excavation areas, along streams, lakes, within a floodplain. Don't want your manure piles inundated with floodwaters. There's going to be differences in different states with how close you can be to a private well or a public water supply. These numbers are for North Dakota. And so then I just put on here to keep in mind, no matter where you're at, site selection is important for manure, for dry lots, for mortality sites, and for compost areas. So all of these things require site selection, and this stuff is important for that. Okay, so manure management this spring. You might be in a place where there's no snow. Maybe it didn't snow that much. Maybe we're done with the snow. It's almost April, you're thinking. Enough with the snow talk. Don't bring it back. But this is what I really want us to do. I want us to assess where you're currently storing the manure, and could it become inundated with floodwater? If it were a winter where we had a lot of snow, would you be able to access that site if we had a lot of mud? So just things to keep in mind for the spring. Assess where you have it now. Turn your snow/bedding pile to keep it heating. I'll talk about that in just a slide here. Clear what you can now to keep your lot dry. And so if you have a lot of snow, or if you were to have a lot of snow last year, next year, just think back to last year and then think ahead for next year. How can we get that out to help our lots dry out quicker? And then plan for next year. So this is why I want us to look back. I want us to assess. I want us to just think back, take a couple notes. I know it's spring. I know it's probably nice out. I know you want to go and rock and roll. But if we can just take a couple notes right now on where is our water setting, where did our snow blow in this year, what was really hard when it was really cold out about managing this stuff, so that we can continue to think and assess and plan for next year. Okay, manure, snow piles, and safety. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the manure snow pile over here on the left-hand side. And that's going to be, I said turn them. So let's go ahead and make sure that we're turning that to keep it heating and get the snow out of there. But the other thing is safety. So when this manure snow pile, I call it manure snow pile because mostly it's hay and snow. There's a little bit of manure in it. And so we want to make sure we're keeping that in a place where it's not going to be draining into anything that that is going to be affected by runoff. So when these people started stacking this, it was over here and it wasn't an issue. But as the winter went on, the snow pile kept growing, and now we're right underneath these power lines here. And so just something to keep in mind. Again, this is for next year. Hopefully we're on the back side of this for now, but just something to assess and think about for next year. All right, so manure storage management considerations. So now I'm just going to ask you a whole bunch of questions And I don't want to do this for overwhelm. I don't want you to get frustrated by this. Just these are things that are going to become important and are important as you're either planning or updating or wanting to be better about your manure management and manure storage area. So, will you compost the manure or will you spread it fresh? If you plan to spread it fresh, will you do it yourself or do you have a custom hauler that you can get to come and do that? If you have a custom hauler, do you have the land to spread it on? And is your manure storage area big enough for their equipment? So something important to keep in mind if you're going to contact somebody custom to do this, what kind of equipment do they have or what kind of space do they need? Where is the manure storage area relative to the dry lot or sacrifice area? So how far are you having to move this stuff when you take it out? Or are you moving it far enough? We'll talk about that in a minute too. And then if you think long-term, how will you manage the manure storage area? Like, what's your general plan for management in that area other than moving it from the barn and dumping it over there? Okay, so I just put this in here. Generally speaking, there's going to be questions on composting. This is a whole day's workshop. And so I just threw one slide in here about the benefits and then one slide for a resource. So the benefits of composting our manure. We're reducing weed seeds, we're reducing pathogens, we're reducing parasites, we're reducing nutrient loss, we're reducing volume of manure, we're increasing nutrient stability. Okay, all really good things. They do take management. It doesn't happen on its own. Okay, so here's a YouTube workshop, basically. And so there's 13 videos that talk all about composting. And we also have a producer interaction video in there. That's video, I believe it's video 12 or 13. So it's down toward the bottom of the list. But again, if you just go to this playlist, you can pick out, oh, I'm really interested in this about composting, and you'll find it. Okay, so back then to the manure storage area. And so I said, how will you manage that area? Composting could be one of those management strategies. Leaving it alone and just stockpiling it and planning to spread it could be one of those strategies. Something else to keep in mind is bedding. And so we use bedding, especially in North Dakota, insulates against frozen ground. And that's all really good stuff. We want that. Keeps our animals clean, keeps them dry. Super important when we have 17 days, sometimes of below zero temperatures. So all really important things. So we have, in North Dakota, we have some special considerations for composting or for our bedding. So straw, it's not everybody's favorite, but it's readily available for us. So some people say it's really hard to pick. It's really hard to kind of manage. It doesn't necessarily soak up moisture the best, but it's very readily available for us. Wood chips, shavings, sawdust, pellets. What are you using? What's common? What do you have close to you? And then location. Are we doing it inside? Are we doing it outside? And how are we doing that? So in North Dakota, I just want us to keep in mind that we bed sooner and longer based on weather. So we're bedding sooner and longer, and this is going to then play into our manure storage area, especially whether that's outside or inside. And of course, we're choosing bedding material based on reducing odors, what's absorbent, what's easy to use, what works in your situation. And so all of those things become important. So then we have barn manure versus pen manure. And so on our barn manure, you can see this system is set up quite handy. You go in, they push it out, all gates open, everything goes out. Wonderful. However, then we end up with our manure down here at the end. You can see in the middle picture, it's at the end, and that's good. What's your plan with it from there? So it's cold outside, or it's hot outside and you're pushing manure, right? Because you still have horses inside and you still want to bed them a little bit. You get the manure out, and then there's 100 other things to do, and you let it sit there, and then what happens? Sometimes we forget to come back to it. So what's our plan once we get it out? Is that our manure storage area? Do we have enough space to do this once a week and continue to keep piling it here? Will we come back right away and clean that up and put it in a different storage area? So what's the plan? And then same thing with outside horse manure area. We want to make sure that we have an area to push it up, to keep our pens dry. Is this our storage area? What does that look like? Okay, so just manure management in general, I think, becomes very important when we're picking or selecting our areas. Now we're going to switch and talk just a little bit about sacrifice areas, which I'll very likely refer to as dry lots for the rest of the time. So dry lot, sacrifice area, exercise paddocks. Some of us use that interchangeably, but really the goal of this area is to have a small area. So we're basically sacrificing a small area of what would typically be like our grazing areas to ensure that the majority of our land has a time it needs to rest and recuperate and stay healthy. And so what becomes important in a dry lot? Shelter, water, feed, and space. And so we're going to talk about those. So location, we already talked about all of that site selection stuff earlier. Soil characteristics and structure, again, not just for site selection and for draining well, but also what can withstand continuous hoof action. And that is also keeping our animal comfort in mind as well. So if it can withstand hoof action, but it's hurting our animals, we don't want that either. Where does water flow? This is something, if you don't have animals yet, and you have the ability to step back for a season before you get them and just look at the land that you're going to put them on, see where your water flows, see where the snow blows in, see kind of how things work, what grows well, what doesn't, what has weeds in it, what doesn't, and just kind of observe. That's a huge thing that would be a positive for you. Ease of use. Where is the sacrifice area relative to the water source, food storage, and manure storage? And then does your area provide adequate exercise area for your animal? So the benefits. Provides a place during extreme wet or drought. Gives pastures that rest that we talked about already. So Paige will talk about this, how it's key to a good rotational grazing system, and provides an outdoor space for horses with metabolic conditions. Okay, so we need some space. If it's too small, there's really not enough room for them to move around. If it's too big, it becomes a little hard to manage. And so I'm thinking, from the aspect of picking manure and just, keeping things clean. And in this space, we'll need some permanent fence. For the ground, we want to remove our manure regularly. Drag the pen occasionally. It helps to maintain a level lot and make sure that everything is level and that we're not having issues in just one area of that pen. Especially here, like it says, high traffic areas. Can we build some paths to help control mud and erosion, especially around waters or gates, feeding areas, places where they would normally have a lot of hoof action? Some other considerations for management over a dry lot is going to be manure collection. So collecting manure and moving it out of that dry lot area is going to help with our fly infestation. Where is that manure storage area that we talked about a little bit ago relative to this dry lot? So sometimes close is nice because you are more enticed to do it. It's not so far. You can reach it quickly. You don't have to spend all night walking across the yard to come back again, and you'd rather be out with your horses. However, sometimes too close isn't good either, depending on odor or flies and how we're actually going to manage that area. And then again, is your storage area large enough for the kind of equipment that you're going to use? Are you only using a pitchfork? Are you using a skid steer? Are you big enough that you're using a payloader, some kind of front end loader? Like, what does that look like? Fly control then also with this manure collection, by keeping your sacrifice area clean and turning the manure piles in the storage area weekly, you can compost that and stay ahead of the flies. And so having, again, the storage area in a place where you're going to access it and manage it becomes important. If it's out of sight, out of mind, sometimes we forget to take care of that area. And so we're not going to go in deep into internal parasites. This is something that we really want you to connect with your local veterinarians on. However, these are just a few things that we talk about in our parasite webinar. Again, we have an hour-long webinar where Dr. Hammer goes through all of the different strategies, but we just picked a few out for today. So removing manure daily from stalls and runs. Be sure pastures and paddocks are well drained and not overpopulated. So again, things that we've talked about already. Composting your manure before spreading it instead of spreading raw manure is a good idea. And then using a hay feeder, really just to get them off the ground. Fly control programs, keeping things clean, examining your horses. And again, all of this goes back to working with your veterinarian. What's normal for your horse? What are they comfortable with? What are you comfortable with? And making a plan. Okay, there was some mud talk. The University of Minnesota Extension has a whole educational part about managing mud on horse farms. And so we link that here, and that's also in our resources. What I am going to say is sometimes it's going to look like this. And you're thinking, like, I don't want a dry lot because I don't want it to look like that. But just remember, if it looks like this for just a little bit versus you can see in the background where the pasture is, the background back there is what we're sacrificing this area they're on now. It's going to look like this for a little bit sometimes in North Dakota, but we're giving our pasture a rest, a chance to get ahead, to dry up, to make sure all of our productive land does not turn into this. And just a note on this picture, preferred if we remove that net wrap, just for safety reasons and also for horse health reasons. And so I know sometimes this is real, but we don't always like to see the net wrap on our horse's hay. Okay, and then again, we have at least 2, possibly 3 manure management hour-long webinar presentations in that list. And so no restrictions in North Dakota as far as when to spread manure. There's a lot of information, though, on spreading manure in those presentations. And so this is just a quick, there's no restrictions as far as when to spread. A lot of it comes down to common sense. We don't spread before, during, or after large rain events. We don't spread where water quality will be compromised. We don't spread where there's going to be runoff issues ever. And so those are just a few things to keep in mind. And then before we're done with this, I do want to talk about mortality disposal. So again, we're not going to go into this. We did do a webinar on mortality disposal, and so that's in the list as well. However, something to keep in mind is sometimes our animals do die. And we do need to have a plan of how to dispose of them. So planning for equine mortalities. This is, again, another University of Minnesota photo. They have a whole series on composting your mortality. However, you can see that there are some other options in North Dakota as well. And so this is going to depend on where you're at, your location. Is there something, somebody close to you that renders? Is burial an option based on your water table and where you're at? Do you have the equipment to do that? Is landfilling something that you want to do? And so they're not fun things to think about. These questions are not great to ask. However, if you do have, only 4 acres or 5 acres that you're managing your horses on and something does happen, I really like for you guys to have a plan before that happens. So at least here's my plan and here's what I can do. So my suggestion, think about a mortality disposal plan. If you do plan to bury, make sure you're calling 811. And this is something that you can discuss with your veterinarian as far as, hey, if something ever happens, this is what I want to do. This is how I want to proceed. And then also that'll help you think about your disposal options. Okay, so as a quick review of that, manure contains valuable nutrients. Plants need them, but we also don't want them to become a pollutant. We don't want to waste them, and we don't want to pollute the water that's around us. Composting reduces weed seeds, which a lot of you had questions about or had said this was an issue. So composting is something that is helpful. Pathogens, it reduces parasites and volume of manure that's there. And we know with parasites, it also flies. The goal of the dry lot area is to just sacrifice that small area, the small, ugly little area that sometimes gets a little muddy in the spring, so that we are not wrecking the rest of our productive land. Proper manure management can lead to reduced parasite load. Again, discuss a plan with your veterinarian, and then use common sense when we're going to do it outside, when we're going to spread our manure. Just a common sense thing. With that, Paige, are there any questions that we need to address now or comments before we move on?
Yeah, we did have one particularly about composting. In North Dakota, can people burn their manure or their compost piles instead of spreading it?
Oh my. Um, I don't want you to do that. I think that they're really great nutrients. I will have to say that that's going to have to be a regulatory question. So I can look that up, and if you want to private message me, I can get back to you on that. Um, I don't know what the regulations are as far as burning manure. However, I would just encourage you guys to really think about composting it and using it. Like your horses are giving you nutrients back, and so put that back on your grazed land. Okay? But I will, if you private message me in here, I will find something and get back to you.
All right, I think that is all for now, Mary. We'll see if anybody comes up with any more questions as we go on.
Okay?
All right, so let's talk a little bit about grazing. Most people want to see their horses graze the majority of the season, the growing season anyway, and that's possible even on small acreages if we manage it correctly. The trick with horses is they're able to graze very, very close to the ground. You know, they can really trim that grass plant down to about dirt level that can, make our plants hard to thrive and grow back. So the key is proper management here. One strategy is going to be delaying pasture turnout, and this can be hard whether you're on small acreage or not. As soon as it sort of starts to green up in April, we get really excited. Our horses are really excited to get those bites of green grass, and we want to just kick them out and turn them out. Ideally, we want to wait until the grass has reached a minimum of 3 to 3.5 leaves. And we go by a leaf stage growth instead of height because every plant is a little bit different on how tall they get. If we have a pasture with a ton of Kentucky bluegrass, it might never get very tall, but the leaf will still have the 3 to 3.5 leaf stage. Typically in North Dakota, this is going to be in May, and it depends on whether you're in the far southwest corner or up in the northeast or where you're at. But sometime in May is when most of our grasses are reaching that 3 to 3.5 leaf stage. Again, it's not necessarily height dependent. If you are more comfortable going off of height, one rule of thumb you'll hear out there is 6 to 8 inches. But again, that's for our some of our cool season grasses like our smooth brome that follow that guideline. It doesn't apply to all grasses and it doesn't apply to our warm season grasses. So it's kind of a tricky method. The best method is the leaf stage, 3 to 3.5 leaves. So the other thing to keep in mind when we're grazing is, some horses are sensitive to starches and those lush green flushes of grass in that May, June, high rainy season period when our cool season grasses are growing very quickly. Typically, we have this season again in September and October when moisture and cool seasons grasses are growing quickly. Some horses are very sensitive to the high amount of non-soluble or sugars, I guess would be the easy way to say it, the higher sugars in the plant. So um, keep that in mind. We want to introduce horses very slowly to feed changes to minimize digestive upset and other issues that can come with that. If you have a horse that's susceptible, we can certainly go into more detail on ways to manage that. Do not overgraze. It can be easier said than done, right? Because not every horse goes out there and takes the same size bite out of every single plant. They don't graze uniformly. They're going to pick areas of the pasture where they graze down much shorter, and then other areas where they don't touch the grass at all. Um, on average, you want to look across your grazing cell and say, okay, when that plant is approximately halfway consumed on the leaf tissue, so not necessarily on the height again, but about approximately halfway consumed, meaning ideally the horse has taken a bite out of every single plant on the average across your pasture. That's when you want to remove them and give a break or a rest. Okay. Again, keeping in mind that some areas they're going to graze down to very little and some they're not going to touch. And you just have to move them anyway. And we'll talk about, mowing that grass afterwards. And then the rotation strategy we're going to talk about in a little bit. That's going to help deal with minimizing weeds and hopefully keeping that grass in a growth stage. So here's an example of one way that you can rotational graze on small acreage. You have your perimeter fence around the outside of your entire property area where you want to graze. You put all your horses in one pasture or one pen. That sacrifice area can be open all the time. Maybe that's where you have a bale of hay, that's where you have a water, that's where you have shelter. And then you allow horses restricted access to just one cell and rotate to the next pasture either by the consumption rate or every 7 to 10 days, about weekly. Move the horse to a fresh piece of ground. After you move your horses to a fresh cell, you're going to go in the cell they were just in and mow after each rotation. That's going to do a couple different things. It's going to spread your manure out, expose them to sunlight, reduce that parasite burden. It's going to keep that plant in a vegetative stage where it's always growing and producing plant leaf tissue instead of that seed head that's going to stop your growth of your grass. And typically grasses aren't as palatable once they get to that reproductive stage where they're putting on that seed head. Okay. In a perfect world, you want to go through all your cells in about 30 days to 45 days. So a month and a half, you're going to transition your horse through all of those cells. So you can create the number of cells that works best in your property and your situation. This diagram here has 6 different grass cells. And just keep repeating that throughout the season. There's going to be months and periods of time when rainfall is less, temperatures are higher, and the grass production naturally slows, depending upon your species. And then there's going to be times where grass grows really quickly. So managing these cells is one way to keep that green area the entire time that you're grazing, green vegetative area. And if you get a heavy rainstorm, if you get times when things aren't going real great, you can always put them back into that dry lot portion where they don't have access to kind of trample or cause a lot of damage to your grassy areas. Fencing is the next thing we're going to talk about. First and foremost is to keep it safe. So there's a variety of different fences, and what I recommend when people come and we visit about it, we can go through a variety of options that are common in North Dakota, easily found in supply stores, and then go and look at pictures or go visit other horse operations and look at what they have and what they like, ask them what they like, what they don't like. Ideally, you want to invest in the best fence that you can from the get-go. And that perimeter fence a lot of times is people's priority, and those cross fences can be sometimes more temporary or easier to move around. So safe fences for horses are generally considered steel, pipe, wood, electric fences of multiple strands, no climb mesh wire. Those are common or more common for horse operations. We definitely want to avoid barbed wire, and we know that in North Dakota there's a very common fencing material, but horses and barbed wire just don't mix. So we don't recommend certainly installing that new. If you're at a place where you don't have the ability to rip out all of the barbed wire, we'd recommend installing a temporary electric fence inside of that barbed wire to keep the horses away from it. Single strand fences are not a great idea. We want to have multiple strands so that if you do have failure where one wire breaks, you have a backup. And then anything that doesn't provide good visibility, especially think if you have a white fence only, that can be very difficult to see in winter months. So we want to have different variations of color and high visibility for horses and human alike. We want to make sure that they're durable. These dry lot scenarios or these small pen scenarios, the horses tend to pressure them quite significantly, especially if there's delicious green grass right on the outside of that dry lot. They're going to be pushing and exhibiting a lot of force on that fence. You want to make sure that they're durable, or you might have to consider putting an electric strand inside if it's not so durable fence. No matter what you choose, regular maintenance is going to be essential. So checking your perimeter fence regularly. I'd recommend daily riding or walking the perimeter of your fences to check for any weak areas or broken areas. An appropriate height for horse fence is at least 5 foot. 5 foot tall is the recommendation. 5.5 or 6 foot is even better. If you have extremely large horses or stallions or things that pressure fence more, taller is better. As far as post spacing recommendations, usually your line posts are going to be 10 to 12 feet, and that's going to depend on the material that you choose. Whereas your electric fences, they can get spread out to 25 feet or more between line posts. Keep in mind where you're placing your gates, where they're located, and then make sure that they're wide enough to easily get equipment in and out. So sometimes we might say, okay, well, this 8-foot gate is a little bit cheaper or more affordable, or I was able to install that there. but then it's really difficult for our manure haulers or to get large equipment in and out to do some fixing or repairing on the grading and dirt work in our dry lot pens. So bigger gates are always recommended. And then having a non-electric gate for horses is a good idea too. Not saying that you can't use the electric gates around horses, but when you're, for a human safety standpoint, when you're leading them in and out, horses tend to get a little bit more nervous if that gate is electric. So having an area that is non-electric is helpful. And when it comes down to that cross fencing, you don't necessarily have to have the same fence for your cross fencing. Sometimes it can be shorter, temporary, something that's easy to take in and out, move, roll up. So using your discretion and what you choose on your operation, there's certainly a lot of options. Shelter is recommended, whether this is in your, usually it's in the dry lot portion of your area, because that's where you're going to have your horses in the winter and in those times where it's poor weather conditions. Shelters are going to provide shade, windbreak, and a dry space in wet weather. They don't necessarily have to be man-made. They can be natural. So trees, a tree row provides a windbreak. Stacking hay bales strategically in areas that are safe and sturdy can be another option. And then sometimes our natural terrain provides a little bit of shelter. So it just depends on where you're at and what space you have to deal with. For man-made shelters, windbreak fences work really well. They can be permanent or temporary. Three-sided shelters are common on horse operations, loafing sheds, some people call them. And then, of course, our full enclosed barns are another option for man-made shelter. When it comes to space requirements, a minimum of 12 by 12 foot per horse is recommended. So that's 144 square feet per animal. More is better if you have larger groups or mixed herds where you have horses coming and going frequently to where that herd dynamic gets shuffled up. We typically are going to want more at that time as well. So here's some windbreak variations or different options. We have natural trees in the background along with hay bales that can be lined up, provide from some windbreak. You'll notice the bedding that's provided there. We have our three-sided sheds. That shed would be a smaller one. It looks like that would be best for 1 to 3 horses. Stacking hay bales is an option. You have to worry about safety sometimes with that. If horses get to pushing and rubbing when they're stacked too high like that, that could be a safety issue if those bales were to fall. And then we have a couple different options for portable windbreaks as well, vertical wood slats or some steel. Safety is a big concern when it comes to our shelter options as well. Make sure we're using durable materials that are also going to stand up to horses rubbing on them. They're not going to get blown over in the wind, and then have smooth edges. Horses are notorious for placing their legs in places that could definitely injure them. So we want to make sure that those steel windbreaks are smooth. There aren't any sharp edges. Water supply is the next thing we're going to talk about. Depending upon where you're at, that might vary. Typically, our groundwater supplies are a little bit more reliable, or a lot bit more reliable for quality as well. And that could be a well on your area, or if you have access to city water or rural water source. But groundwater is typically going to be higher quality. Surface water is less reliable, certainly not going to be an option through our winter months. And then depends on where your land is and how it's sloped. It just isn't as desirable for a reliable water source. Definitely want to check on your water source daily. So make sure that it's clean and that it's functioning and that's working. Regularly draining and cleaning tanks or automatic waterers is a good idea. Having them at a location where it slopes away from the water pad so we don't create a ice skating rink or a muddy area right in front of our water source. Continuing to build up that grade and working around your water is essential throughout the year. Planning that location, you're going to need electricity in North Dakota for our winter months. We need that heat source to keep our waters working well. So whether that's in a tank and a single electric water heater or through a automatic water. Either way, electricity is usually essential. Keep in mind where our snow drifts are going to be placed. So when we get those windy conditions and snow starts blowing around, where are we drifting? We don't want our water and our shelters and our hay to completely be drifted in. We want to make sure it's accessible to both horse and human. The other thing I can talk about is testing your water. So we mentioned observing the water daily. Testing your water frequently is also recommended, and we'll include those links in the chat and send those to you as well on the procedure of how to do that. Anywhere from annually to every 2 or 3 years is recommended. Next thing we're going to discuss is weed control. So having a healthy pasture and rotating and managing your grasses to the correct height is the first step. However, some weeds are inevitable. Weeds come in through hay, other animals tracking weed seeds in, birds depositing weed seeds, and then horses, like we said, are notorious for grazing short. And the more dirt we have exposed, the more opportunistic those weeds are going to come in and move in. So some weeds are inevitable. What are we going to do about controlling them? You have some options. So some cultural methods are going to include rotating to avoid overgrazing and composting those weed seeds to minimize kind of the amount of weed seeds that are in the area. Mechanically includes mowing after each rotation and before those weeds set seed. So keeping those weeds short and in a vegetative stage is going to minimize the spread of a lot of our weed species out there. Not all, but a lot of them. Biological control methods could include including other species. So if you have other animals on your place, rotating sheep or goats through the pastures can help consume weeds. Sheep typically enjoy consuming forbs, and goats typically enjoy consuming those woodier plant species more than the grasses. There are some parasite concerns when you're commingling different species together, so that's something to be aware of. But if a biological method of controlling weeds is something you want to look into, that's one option. And then lastly, the chemical option. So this includes using pesticide, herbicide products to spot spray those weeds in your pasture. It's essential that you read the labels to know what you're applying and that it's labeled for the correct plant and correct weeds that you're targeting and following restrictions on those labels. You don't want to go out and accidentally kill your desirable grass species because of reading the wrong product or purchasing the wrong product. And that's where considering hiring a custom spray or somebody experienced in this area might benefit you as well. There is a lot of intricacies that go into controlling weeds well in a horse pasture using chemicals. So we're going to list some resources here. These will be included in the follow-up email to you, so you can certainly go in more depth and give you just a lot of options to really dig in and see how you can best manage your horses, whether you have 1 to 5 acres or 20 acres or more. So at this time, I want to encourage you guys again, drop those questions in the chat. We could also have you unmute your microphones at the end if you'd prefer to ask them verbally. What questions do you have for Mary or I? Mary, it looks like there's one for you. Is there an efficient way to spread the manure?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm super curious to see what other people are doing here, because I have to tell you that the most efficient way is with a spreader. And it doesn't always have to be like a huge spreader, right? I know $5,000 is still a lot, but there are some really nice smaller spreaders for under $5,000 that hook up to your side-by-side, your four-wheeler. They do a really nice job. So I really do like a spreader is best as far as like a spread pattern and getting it across there nicely, helping to break it up, because when it comes out of those beaters, it's going to break it up a little bit so that we're not having big clumps here and there. So if you guys want to put in the chat privately or publicly and tell us what you're doing, that'd be great. Or an old tractor. Yes. Yep. Old tractors work too.
So there's other operations that I've seen go the good old-fashioned way with a pitchfork. So it's definitely higher labor, but some people will pitch their manure if they just have 1 or 2 horses and are bedding not a lot or sparsely bedding, or maybe they're using a type of bedding that's easier to spread. I've seen people that will pitch it into the back of their pickup and then drive around their pastures and pitch it out by hand and then drag it around. So there's all sorts and types of ways to do it depending upon the resources and what you want to invest in it and your labor, availability.
Okay, I think with that, seeing not too many questions, we will end for the day. And just thank you guys again so much for joining us for our series. And we will send this out when it's ready.